Hello everyone, and welcome back to Esoteric Elysium. If you're new here, this is part 2 of exploring the biblical pseudo-history iceberg. This was originally posted on Reddit as the Biblical Academic Studies iceberg, and all credit goes to the Reddit user who created it. Otherwise, if you've seen my first video, I go through tiers 1 through 3. Please be sure to check that out if you haven't already. Regardless if you are new or already seen my first video, thank you very much for tuning in. But without further ado, let's jump back into the biblical pseudo-history iceberg, kicking it off with tier 4. Testimonium Flavium contains later additions. Building on an earlier entry, the Testimonium Flavium, or the Testimony of Flavius Josephus, is a passage found in Book 18 of Flavius Josephus's work, Antiquities of the Jews. In this passage, he describes Jesus Christ as a wise man, a worker of wonders, and a teacher who won over many followers, including Jews and Greeks. He also says that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate only to rise again on the third day as was foretold. Basically, word for word what happens in the gospel narratives. However, an agreement on this work's authenticity is far from reached. The arguments surrounding the authenticity of the testimonium fall into two categories. Internal arguments that rely on textual analysis and compare the passage with the rest of Josephus's work, and external arguments that consider the wider cultural and historical context. Some of the external arguments are quote-unquote arguments from silence, aka arguments that question the authenticity of the entire passage not for what it says, but due to lack of references to it among other ancient sources. This has caused some to theorize that parts or possibly even all of the work were later additions snuck in by early Christians. This view was pioneered by one Gary Goldberg in 1995. Goldberg found some partial matches between the Testimonium and Luke chapter 24, verses 19 through 21 and verses 26 through 27, stating, quote, "The Emmaus narrative more closely resembles the Testimonium in its phrase-by-phrase outline of contents and order than any other known text of comparable age," end quote. Goldberg's analyses suggested three possibilities. 1, that the matches were random. 2, that the Testimonium was a Christian interpolation based on Luke. Or 3, that both the Testimonium and Luke were based on the same sources. In a later work, published in 2022, Goldberg investigated Josephus's paraphrase style and concluded only the last of these possibilities could explain why the Emmaus Testimonium language relationships were end-to-end consistent with Josephus's methods of revision. If true, this muddies the waters quite substantially. Is the version we have today of Josephus's work a forgery? Did Josephus Flavius get this material from people who knew Jesus? Did he consult Christians and just write down what they told him? We may never know. The Moabite Stone. In the previous third tier, we covered the Merneptah Stele, an Egyptian artifact that contains one of the few Iron Age references to Israel. The Moabite Stone, or Mesha Stele, is another one. Dated to around 840 BC, it is a Moabite artifact telling how the Moabite god Chemosh allowed his people to be subjugated to the Israelites, only to then return their lands to Moab. It gets the name Mesha Stele due to it supposedly being authored, but certainly being about, the ancient king of Moab, Mesha. Since the inscription is in a strange variant of Phoenician and Paleo-Hebrew, it is very, very difficult to translate. But what we can glean from it, the stele describes how Moab was oppressed by Omri, king of Israel, and his son as a result of the anger of the god Chemosh, Mesha's victories over Omri's son, not named, and the men of Gad at Ataroth, Nebo and Jahaz, his building projects, is restoring the fortifications of his strong palaces and building a palace and reservoirs for water. His wars against Hadoram, possibly referring to the city of Honoraim. Of interest here is that the Moabites, according to the Bible, were also descendants of Abraham, and that the Israelites were specifically commanded to not take the lands of Moab, since God had intended for those regions to belong to that kingdom alone, per his promise to Abraham. So when the Israelites come in and take it anyway, the Moabites, who have strayed away into paganism, figure their God must be angry with them. But in reality, in the Bible, it is God who is angry with the Israelites for conquering Moab. Ironically, the Moabites were more faithful to their false god than the Israelites were to the true God. Israelites were a branch of the Canaanites. Who the Israelites were, where, and more specifically who they came from, is a fascinating subject once you really look into it. Simply speaking, the Israelites are the descendants of Israel, the grandson of Abraham. Abraham, the patriarch of the Israelites, was from the land of Ur, part of the ancient Sumerian kingdom, which is found in modern-day Iraq. But in Genesis, God calls Abraham out of Ur to a special place, which he promises to give to Abraham's descendants. The place Abraham and his family settled in, the place his son Isaac and his grandson Jacob, renamed Israel, was Canaan. The same place the Israelites would later return to, led by Moses and Joshua, and reclaim from the Canaanite tribes. This begs the question, were the Israelites just another Canaanite tribe? One that was carried off into Egypt, see the entry on the Merneptah stele in the previous video for more information, and returned stronger, larger, and under the banner of a different god. It would appear so, but there are many other elements to this. Yes, the family that was the progenitor of the Israelites was from Canaan, but not originally. Abraham's family lived in Sumer. The apocryphal work of Enochian literature, the Apocalypse of Abraham, describes his father as a Sumerian sorcerer, but we don't know if they were originally even from Sumer. Of interest to me, in his 2025 academic paper, The Aryan Hypothesis, Johann, I don't know how to say that name, argues that Abraham's lineage may actually stem from the European continent. His evidence for this is that an anomalous steppe DNA haploid group popped up in the Levant around the same time Abraham was supposed to have settled there. This is markedly different than the makeup of the other Canaanite groups there. Not saying that's correct, I just find it interesting. I might actually do a full video on that one day. Another point to consider is that in the ancient world, what made you part of a tribe or a group wasn't really your genetics, but your practices. Many of the Israelite tribes were not biologically related to Abraham in any way. The tribe of Dan, for instance, were probably Greeks. There's an entry in the last tier that expands on that. Stay tuned for that. All this to say, it's a complex issue, but the genetic and cultural origins of the Israelites is an iceberg in and of itself. The Books of Enoch. The Books of Enoch are ancient Jewish writings attributed to Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, and one of the only two people in the Old Testament where it is specifically said they were taken up directly to heaven. These books are not in most Bibles, but are instead examples of Apocrypha, texts written centuries later in the name of a famous biblical figure. They were believed to have been composed mainly between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD. They expand on brief, mysterious Genesis stories, particularly the discourse surrounding the Nephilim and the so-called sons of God. The Book of Enoch usually refers to one Enoch, also called the Ethiopic Enoch, the best-known version. It survives complete only in an ancient Ethiopian language and was rediscovered in the West in the 1700s. Fragments in Aramaic and Hebrew were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. This composite work has 5 main sections believed to have been written by different people. The Book of the Watchers, which is chapters 1 through 36, this is about 200 angels called the Watchers, descend to the earth, lust after human women, father violent giants, aka the Nephilim, teach forbidden skills like weapons, sorcery, and astrology. This corrupts humanity, prompting the flood. In this book, Enoch tours heaven, sees the day of judgment, and intercedes for the angels who are punished. This is believed to be about the sons of God. The second part is the Book of Parables, chapters 37 to 71. This is really, his visions of the final judgment and a messianic son of man, aka Jesus Christ. The third book is the Astronomical Book, chapters 72 to 82. This has various old world discourse on the sun, the moon, the stars, and a 364-day calendar. Then you have the Book of Dreams and Visions, chapters 83 to 90. This contains symbolic history of the world and Israel. Then the Epistle of Enoch, chapters 91 to 108. These are almost like Proverbs in the Book of Wisdom, moral warnings and promises of resurrection for the righteous. And then 2 Enoch, which describes Enoch's journey through multiple heavens in creation stories. 3 Enoch portrays Enoch transforming into the angel Metatron, I'm not making that up, near God's throne. These apocalyptic texts explore evil's origins, cosmic order, divine judgment, and hope for the righteous. They influenced early Hebrew and Christian ideas, but were excluded from most canons. Today, these books offer vivid insight into Second Temple Judaism's worldview. The various Christian churches of the world have different stances on these works, but generally do not see them as divinely inspired or canonical. The only churches that do are the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church and the Eritrean Orthodox Tewahedo Church. Mount Sinai isn't on the Sinai Peninsula. In the Bible, Mount Sinai is the mountain upon which Moses was said to have received the Ten Commandments from God. The most widely accepted location of Mount Sinai is a mountain in, you guessed it, the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. Also known as Jabal Musa, it is a 7,497-foot tall mountain near the city of St. Catherine in the region known today as the Sinai Peninsula. It is surrounded on all sides by higher peaks in the mountain range of which it is a part. If we return to our author Flavius Josephus, he wrote that, quote, Moses went up to a mountain that lay between Egypt and Arabia, which was called Sinai, end quote. There is evidence that the biblical Mount Sinai actually lies elsewhere. For example, since Moses is described by the Bible as encountering Jethro, a Kenite who was a Midianite priest, shortly before going up Sinai, this could suggest that Sinai would be somewhere near their territory in Saudi Arabia, not Egypt. This would place it somewhere in the land of the biblical Edom. Another example, in early Christian times, a number of Anchorites, a Christian sect, settled on Mount Serbal, considering it to be the biblical mountain, and in the 4th century a monastery was constructed at its base. Nevertheless, Josephus had stated that Mount Sinai was, quote-unquote, the highest of all the mountains thereabout, which would imply that it's actually Mount Catherine, which is also in the Sinai Peninsula, was actually the mountain in question, if Sinai was to be sighted on this peninsula at all. UFO in Ezekiel. Ezekiel is considered among one of the greatest of the Old Testament prophets, having many prophecies about Christ, the church, etc. In the beginning of his book, he has quite a memorable vision. It is too long to recite here, but to summarize what he sees in the book of Ezekiel chapter 1, he sees a massive cloud filled with raging fire, flashing incessantly, enveloped in brightness in the color of glowing amber. Within the fire emerge 4 creatures. Each possesses 4 faces, that of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. Each of these creatures have 4 wings. Their legs are straight and stiff like a calf's, gleaming like burnished bronze. Under their wings on all 4 sides appear human hands. The living creatures do not turn as they move, each advances straight forward in the direction of its front face. Beside each of these 4 creatures on the ground stands a wheel. The wheels sparkle. Each wheel has another wheel intersecting it at right angles, forming a kind of gyroscope. The rims of the wheels are high and awesome, and they are completely full of eyes all around. The spirit of the living creatures dwells within the wheels, so that when the creatures move, the wheels move beside them in perfect unity, rising, advancing, or stopping together without deviation. Above the heads of the living creatures stretches an expanse like crystal. Over this firmament appears the likeness of a throne, blue as sapphire. Seated upon the throne is a figure with the appearance of a man. From his loins upwards he shines like glowing metal or fiery amber, surrounded by fire. From his loins downward he appears as burning fire. As I said, the passage is very long, but in my description I tried to use similar language to it. But if you find the time, it is worth reading through it, because it's, as you can see, kind of insane. According to biblical scholars and theologians, Ezekiel is supposed to have witnessed the incomprehensible power and majesty of God and his angels. There's also a lot of teleological meaning. For instance, the 4 creatures, the ones with the human, lion, ox, and eagle faces, would later become associated with the 4 writers of the Gospels. And of course, we can't talk about the wheels within wheels covered in eyes without mentioning the biblically accurate angel discourse, if we can even call it that. It's really more a meme at this point. But what if it was a UFO? I mean, come on, it makes sense. No writer at this time could even have the vocabulary to describe some sort of advanced alien spacecraft. There's attempts to, with the talk of wheels and angels and such, but I don't know. It seems pretty likely to me. I'm kidding. Take your boomer, conspiracy, ancient aliens, 3 a.m. History Channel crap out of here, man. Seeing God, in my opinion, is way cooler than seeing an alien. Just get out of here, man. Reflect on what you're doing for a second. You gotta be kidding me. John didn't write Revelation. As Revelation was pretty well covered in the first video, I won't talk too much about this one. John is referenced in two ways: John the Apostle or the Evangelist, and John of Patmos. This is because he, after a failed execution attempt by the Romans, was exiled to the island of Patmos, where he is believed to have written Revelation. But there is evidence to suggest that the John of Patmos was a different writer, a different person. Pretty standard. We've kind of already talked about this kind of thing. There's evidence that he wrote it, there's evidence that he's not. There's not a single author in the Bible where that discourse doesn't exist. The Tel Dan Stele. The Tel Dan Stele is a fragmented 9th century BC basalt monument discovered in the 90s during excavations at Tel Dan in northern Israel, led by archaeologist Avraham Biran. Fragments were found reused in an ancient stone wall. Written in Old Aramaic using Phoenician script, the stele is a victory monument likely erected by King Hazael of Aram Damascus, who lived in the 800s BC, or his son. The surviving text boasts of military triumphs over Israel and Judah, claiming the defeat and killing of Jehoram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, the king of the house of David. This provides the earliest extra-biblical reference to King David and his royal dynasty, confirming that a Davidic line ruled Judah by the 9th century BC, more than a century after David's traditional reign. The inscription aligns with biblical accounts in 2 Kings of Aramaean conflicts between the northern and southern kingdoms. Only a portion of the original stele survives. It is displayed at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem and has been exhibited elsewhere. The find remains one of the most significant discoveries in biblical archaeology, strengthening the historical basis for the Davidic kingdom. As was said, the likely candidate for having erected the stele, according to the Hebrew Bible, is Hazael, king of Aram Damascus, whose language would have been Old Aramaic. He is mentioned in the Bible in 2 Kings as having conquered Israel but not Jerusalem. Paul didn't write Hebrews. This same kind of thing again. There is some evidence Paul didn't write his letter to the Hebrews. Why this theory primarily exists boils down to the writing style, it being a more polished highbrow Greek, and the lack of an author's name in the introduction. A PSA here: for the remainder of this iceberg, I am going to skip over entries about X didn't write X, because frankly they're pretty boring. However, if you want to debate about authorship disputes, please feel free to leave a comment below. Genesis copies Sumerian myths. You see this brought up a lot, particularly from atheists, to try to prove that Genesis is fake or plagiarized. People observe its similarity to the Sumerian creation story. Both the stories talk about the universe being created from waters, which are held as chaos imagery. Humans are formed from clay or dust, and in both, humanity first dwells by the Tigris and Euphrates, and even the first man in Sumerian myths is called Adamu or Adapa, very similar to the biblical Adam. Of course, the easiest conclusion is that Genesis was plagiarized or some sort of fan fiction, especially since we know the Sumerian myths predate the Torah. But what I feel many people overlook is that both these stories are roughly Iron Age to Bronze Age literature. As with myths and stories of any age, they have tropes. When Genesis was written, likely by Moses, he was writing to a people who would have already known the Sumerian myths and others like it. Genesis was written for a particular people in a particular time. It uses language and symbolism that the Bronze Age people of Israel would understand. And another point people overlook is the important divergences between the two stories. While the Sumerian myths are one of violence, like Tiamat being torn in half by Marduk to create the heavens and the earth, and humans being made as essentially slaves to alleviate the burdens of the gods. While in Genesis, God creates the world out of love and makes man an unnecessary creature that serves him no purpose simply to love them. The dialogue between the two creation counts is very interesting, but I feel that those who jump to the conclusion that it disproves Genesis are kind of not seeing the forest for the trees. And we are going to call it here for today, folks. I am experimenting with splitting these tiers up into smaller divisions. I'm still new to this whole YouTube thing, and I feel this makes videos more manageable to make and publish regularly. But let me know in the comments, would you rather have longer videos covering multiple tiers, or do you like them being split up and examined more closely? Stay tuned for the next installment. We got 3 more tiers left, and they are jam-packed with some really cool topics. Thank you for stopping by. It means the world, and God bless.